Today, research, research, research. Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, with the latest post covering finance and property news with a distinctively Australian flavour. In our prior shows, we discussed the human and societal burdens arising from prior asbestos-related activities of James Hardie Industries Limited, James Hardie, and CSR Limited, CSR in Australia. Among the societal harms discussed, one of the categories highlighted was the cost of research to find a cure or treatment for asbestos-related disease. Today we delve deeper and review the level of funding provided by James Hardie, CSR, the federal and state governments, cancer bodies and others for research of asbestos-related disease. Such funding is scarce, so we consider factors that may explain the disproportionately low contributions. And we ultimately plead for greater resources and research efforts to ensure future sufferers of mesothelioma and asbestos-related lung cancer are given hope. And I will stress again that this information has been made available by Asbestos Awareness Australia, and the report is available for download. Our researchers found no scholarly material on research funding of asbestos-related diseases in Australia. Moreover, official data on the funding of these diseases is incomplete and opaque. Evidence that is available suggests that funding for research on asbestos-related lung cancer and mesothelioma is very limited and disproportionately low for the burdens suffered, known in medical circles as the DALYS. As highlighted in our prior reports, the only contributions that we are aware of that have been made by James Hardie or CSR for research of asbestos-related disease is a commitment from James Hardie in the Asbestos Injuries Compensation Fund Agreement to contribute $500,000 per annum over 10 years to mesothelioma research. Australian health bodies well understand that mesothelioma is not the same as lung cancer, and yet Cancer Australia presently includes funding for mesothelioma research within its lung cancer funding data. The reason given by Cancer Australia for combining these funding statistics is to fit with international data sets, but the rationales for doing so at a global level are unclear, and our request for funding splits was disregarded. A formal review by Cancer Australia of public funding to support cancer research found that for the period 2006 to 2011, the proportional funding for the combined lung cancer and mesothelioma category compared to incidence, burden of disease and mortality in the Australian population was very low. Similarly, during 2016 to 18, the ratio of research funding to the burden of disease was lower for lung cancer and mesothelioma combined. More recently, a platform established by Cancer Australia called National Cancer Control Indicators excludes mesothelioma from the list of cancers highlighted. Asbestos is not mentioned as a risk factor for any form of cancer, and pancreatic cancer is listed as having the lowest survival rate. The basis for the selection of the cancers and risk factors included on this website are unclear. Now, to its credit, Cancer Australia has established a web page on mesothelioma. This web page includes tables of comparative incidence of cancer types, including mesothelioma, and comparative deaths from cancer types, but excludes a comparative table for survival rates. To fill this gap, we've compiled a table of the 5-year survival rates for the cancer types recorded by the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, and this is available. This table highlights mesothelioma as the outlier with the lowest 5-year survival rate. Lung cancer is marginally better, but is still the form of cancer with the third lowest 5-year survival rate. Our researchers were unable to find evidence on specific levels of government and other funding for cancer research by cancer type. Instead, the Cancer Council Australia submission indicates that the largest funding shares were awarded to breast cancer accounting for 26% of funding and 7% of all cancer deaths, colorectal cancer, 14% of funding with 9% of cancer deaths, and prostate cancer at 13% of funding and 9% of deaths. Notably, lung cancer received only 5% of total funding, despite accounting for nearly 19% of the corresponding deaths. In 1964, a study by Selikoff showed that asbestos workers who smoked had 90 times the risk of developing an asbestos-related cancer than non-smokers with no exposure to asbestos. Even accepting these risk variations, a sizable proportion of people diagnosed with lung cancer today have never smoked. No data was found on the amount or share of funding for mesothelioma research in Australia, but private discussions suggest these levels have been and remain extremely low. The present federal government recently approved 2 immunotherapy drugs for mesothelioma sufferers on the pharmaceutical benefits scheme. This step is commendable and welcome, but it seems wholly insufficient given the scale of deaths from this disease and the record low survival rates. Now let's talk about linkages between research funding levels and improvements in survival rates. A submission by the Cancer Council of Australia to a Senate inquiry concerning funding for research into cancers with low survival rates highlights the likely relationship between improvements in 5-year survival rates and levels of direct research funding. The Lung Foundation of Australia website emphasises this linkage and calls for greater funding of lung cancer research on the grounds that the benefits of research on improving outcomes are undisputed. This linkage between research funding and improved health prognosis is even more compelling with respect to funding for mesothelioma research, given its record low 5-year survival rate and the minimal improvement in this rate over the last 30 years. Some medical professionals suggest there's no point in spending money on mesothelioma research because sufferers die so quickly. We suggest these views require a complete change in mindset. Imagine if the same views had been adopted with respect to AIDS or COVID-19 or other fatal or potentially fatal diseases that are now curable or manageable. So let's talk about the possible factors to explain the disproportionately low research funding levels of asbestos-related disease. Well, first, the Cancer Council of Australia submission notes that cancer patients from socio-economically disadvantaged backgrounds have been found to have poor outcomes for many types of cancer. This point is highly relevant for asbestos-related disease patients because the first 2 waves of asbestos-related disease include mainly working-class families. Secondly, the low levels of research funding for asbestos-related disease are further adversely impacted by personal responsibility concerns. Medical studies confirm that lung cancer is associated with greater stigma issues than other types of cancer and is commonly viewed by the public as self-inflicted and preventable because of its link with smoking. Notably, these stigma issues, the personal responsibility attributions, and the resulting adverse impacts on research contributions apply equally to those with lung cancer who have never smoked. While not demonstrated in medical studies, our research and experiences suggest the stigma, personal responsibility, and research funding concerns that apply to lung cancer may extend to asbestosis and mesothelioma. Comments and responses that we've received or heard about when discussing these diseases include the following. What is mesothelioma? What is asbestosis? Are you a smoker? It is cancer, so there must be many risk factors. But isn't it a working class disease for old men? But the risks of harmful exposure are so low. But I have been exposed to lots of asbestos and I'm okay. But you must have known about the risks of asbestos exposure. It is cancer, so why should you get compensation when I cannot? But the asbestos story is old news, and isn't silicosis a much bigger issue now? Are you still alive? That's a miracle. You're lucky to be alive, so why are you whining? And silence, that is, we don't want to discuss it. These responses are perhaps unsurprising given the lack of basic knowledge across the population about the risks and impacts of asbestos exposure. Our household survey found that 2/3 of Australians did not know what asbestos is or cannot positively identify it as dangerous to health. Even among the better informed households, most believe that fatalities from asbestos-related disease are less than 50 a year. Hence, very few Australians, including medical practitioners, are well informed about mesothelioma, asbestosis, or asbestos-related lung cancer. The facts that sufferers of asbestosis or mesothelioma do nothing to contribute to their deaths, that exposure to asbestos is the only known cause of these diseases, and that the risks of exposure are entirely involuntary, are poorly understood across the community. Most, if not all, of those sufferers were not aware of or were not properly informed about the risks they faced, and they were not able or advised to take precautionary measures. And third, there is a high risk of shame associated with the asbestos history in Australia. As discussed in our prior reports, sales of asbestos-containing materials were permitted by public health bodies and policymakers to continue for many decades after the medical fraternity had clearly demonstrated the lethal nature of this carcinogen. The powers that be have not yet acknowledged this fact or the continuing risks of legacy asbestos and associated mass deaths. Instead, many perhaps hope that the fatalities from asbestos-related disease will fade away without the need to invest in research to find a cure or extend the life of sufferers. Such views are poorly informed. There is no evidence of reducing deaths from mesothelioma, quite to the contrary. Cancer Australia estimates that the number of diagnoses of mesothelioma in 2020 reached a record level of 834, and based on present treatments, these diagnoses will become fatalities in the near term. And finally, the history of asbestos and the documented experience of researchers and scientists working on asbestos-related diseases suggests there are substantial external pressures on persons who elect to specialise or focus on this area of health. Our researchers were surprised initially at the limited nature and scale of the research on asbestos-related diseases, the disproportionately low funding for such research, and the lack of substantive debate and voices advocating on behalf of victims in public forums in Australia. We subsequently realised that the price paid by people who speak out on asbestos concerns can be high and may include the end or stalling of a career, discrediting of their reputations, loss of funding or access to potential funding, and even death threats. As such, the opportunities for researchers, scientists and others to focus on or speak out about asbestos concerns in Australia can be severely limited by professional career and personal concerns and or the possibility of losing existing or future funding. For example, some of the most renowned pioneers of asbestos disease research were influenced, captured or intimidated by the industry, including Richard Dole and Christopher Wagner. As highlighted in our History of Asbestos paper, Dole published a seminal paper in the 1950s on the linkages between exposure to asbestos and lung cancer. However, post the 1950s, he carefully avoided any criticism of the asbestos industry. Indeed, Dole suggested publicly that the industry was behaving responsibly. He acted as a litigation consultant for Turner & Newell, a large asbestos producer in the United Kingdom, and he claimed that there was safe levels of exposure to asbestos. And in 1985, Dole even published on the unjustified threat of prosecution to which industrial companies are increasingly subject. His transparency was later questioned when evidence became available, revealing that his academic colleagues had received a large donation from Turner & Newell, and he had received a long-standing and secret retainer from Monsanto, a large chemical conglomerate. Similarly, after publishing groundbreaking research on mesothelioma in the 1960s, Wagner changed his scientific position radically. In the 1990s, he gave expert witness evidence that mesothelioma is always related to exposure dosages and that chrysotile asbestos is safe regardless of the level of exposure. He further argued that chrysotile fibres could be rendered safe by commercial treatments. These claims were influential and assisted the industry when it sought to resist changes in regulation and workplace practices. On his deathbed in 1998, Wagner confirmed in an interview with Jock McCulloch that his work as a researcher on asbestos-related disease had been hindered by the industry from the mid-1950s, that he had been forced to leave South Africa following death threats, and that he regretted having ever entered this research arena. In a court case in 2000, evidence was submitted of payments received by him from Owens, Illinois, a large user of asbestos, over more than 15 years. These payments were never disclosed in Wagner's publications or in his court proceedings as an expert witness. It is likely that research funding for asbestos science and the ongoing scientific debates are still compromised today by industry funding, influence, and capture, and other financial and political motivations. James Huff suggests that traditional covert influence on occupational and environmental health policies has turned brazenly overt. More than ever before, the OEH community is witnessing the perverse influence and increasing control by industry interests. Huff concludes that the science of occupational and environmental medicine, toxicology, and epidemiology will remain unsatisfactory while much of it is funded and manipulated by industry sponsors and published in journals that do not require disclosure of conflicts of interest. And other scholars also highlight examples of asbestos-related medical publications and research that were criticised heavily when it transpired that the authors had not disclosed the receipt of industry funding in the form of research grants, consultancies, employment positions, and witness fees. Notably, our researchers found no peer-reviewed articles in Australia from any discipline that detail the full history of asbestos in Australia, the long-term human societal harms resulting from legacy asbestos, the associated research developments, the responses by the industry and the federal and state governments to asbestos fatalities and ongoing risks, or the legal or public health settings governing legacy asbestos in homes. Within the legal literature, most of the discussions is restricted to compensation issues. The reputational funding and political risk associated with asbestos continue to discourage talented individuals from entering these fields. Our research suggests the number of senior scholars, researchers, medical specialists and public health and environmental health experts in Australia focusing on asbestos-related disease are small. Without changes to this scenario, the future for sufferers of asbestos-related disease look grim. So in summary, asbestosis and mesothelioma are not associated with smoking or other personal responsibility issues. Quite the contrary. These are man-made or corporate-induced diseases that were and remain preventable by avoiding exposure to asbestos fibres and dust. Both these diseases have dire prognoses. Many of the deaths from asbestos-related diseases involve lung cancer. While smoking is a primary risk factor for lung cancer, asbestos exposure increases the risks for smokers exponentially, and some people diagnosed with lung cancer have never smoked. We're not aware of Australian-based research or publications on the linkages between asbestos exposure and lung cancer. Given the estimated 3,000 deaths each year from asbestos-related lung cancer, this area deserves much greater research attention. Private funding provided by James Hardy and CSR for research of asbestos-related diseases appears to be scarce, and the Cancer Australia data points to disproportionately low levels of public funding for lung cancer and mesothelioma research for the burden suffered. Mesothelioma research in particular appears to have been treated as a low, if not the lowest priority form of cancer, and it's been given minimal consideration and funding by cancer bodies and governments. Summary reasons for the low amounts of funding provided for research on asbestos-related diseases are likely explained at least in part by, firstly, the working class backgrounds of many patient cohorts. Next, the stigma linked to disease of the lung. Third, the public's poor understanding of the risks and consequences of the asbestos crisis. Fourth, the shame associated with the history of asbestos. And fifth, the continued reputational, commercial and political pressure on researchers. The general linkages between the levels of research funding on the disease and improved outcomes for sufferers are well acknowledged. Given the minimal funding for research of mesothelioma, the bare improvements in the survival rates of this disease over the last 30 years are unsurprising. Without committed and ongoing research funding, researchers are unlikely to focus on this disease, and novel but riskier research ideas to find a cure, or at least to make mesothelioma a chronic rather than a fatal disease, are unlikely to proceed. Greater research funding and consideration from James Hardy and CSR, federal and state governments, cancer bodies and other contributors is called for and appropriate, given firstly the large number of deaths from lung cancer and mesothelioma in Australia each year, the dire prognosis of both diseases, the absence or limitations of existing treatments, the involuntary nature of exposure causing mesothelioma. And finally, a word about Asbestos Australia Limited, which is a registered not-for-profit company, limited by guarantee, and it's a registered charity. And it says the endorsement from the Australian Tax Office as a gift-deductible recipient. The company was set up to promote and enhance public awareness and knowledge of the dangers and consequences of asbestos exposure in Australia, and to advocate for legal and social reforms that prevent or minimise the harms from asbestos-related disease in Australia, and to promote actions that prevent or minimise the harms from asbestos-related disease in Australia. To achieve its objectives, the company provides public access to widely sourced information on asbestos risks and impacts, including the associated medical, legal and political debates. I'm Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Many thanks for watching, and I'll see you again next time.